Hello class, and welcome back. In our last lesson, we looked at ways to increase self-motivation. In this lesson, we will discuss how to define our life's roles, how to set goals, how to commit to those goals, and how to affirm those goals to ourselves. So let's begin. As we begin this section, I'd like for each of you to ask yourselves these questions. First, if your life was as good as it could possibly be, what would it look like? Secondly, what would you have, do, and be? Whether you realize it or not, I just asked you to define your ideal life. I asked you to determine where you'd like to be and identify the goals for your life. For some of you, these were pretty easy questions to answer. However, I'm sure some of you probably had some difficulty answering these questions simply because you're still trying to determine where you want your life to be. When we discussed motivation, we talked about how what we value and our expectation of success affects motivation. We also talked about how important it was to assess value and determine how we can reach our expectations, given an appropriate amount of effort. But what do you do when you're unsure of your future? How can you be motivated to work towards something if you don't know what that something is? Therefore, it's important for us to set goals for ourselves so we can work towards our ideal futures with a sense of purpose. Let's think of this another way. If you were going on a road trip, would you go out, get in a car, and just start driving without having a location in mind? Would you strike out on the trip without looking at your gas gauge or checking your bank account to see how much money you have to spend? Although there is a sense of adventure that goes along with striking out on such a journey, most of us would probably feel a little intimidated by such a trip. Therefore, we'd probably want to take some time to look at a map, look for interesting locations, or identify some attractions we'd like to visit. So if we agree that such a process makes sense for us when taking a road trip, then why do we not do the same thing in regards to the journey that is our life? According to psychologist Brian Tracy, many people resist setting life goals simply because they don't know how. So over the next few minutes, we will look at ways we can set life goals, analyze our current life roles, and establish criteria for setting realistic goals. Before we can adequately set a life goal, we need to determine any current life roles that we have or are engaged in. Simply put, a life role is any activity to which we regularly devote large amounts of time and energy. Whether we realize it or not, we may have many roles that occupy our time. Those may include being a student, being a son or daughter, being a boyfriend or girlfriend, being a parent, being a spouse, being an employee, or even playing on a team and being a teammate to others. As you can see, it's very easy to see that we can have many life roles that occupy our time. In fact, most people can easily identify 4 to 7 major life roles. However, if you have more than 7 life roles, you need to ask yourself if you may be spreading yourself too thin. If you have too many life roles, you may have to eliminate some of them while you're in college so you can devote more time to your other life roles, such as being a student. Once you've identified your life roles, the next step is to think about creating motivating long-term goals for each one. Therefore, it becomes important for us to have some criteria to utilize as we set goals for each of our life roles. To be motivating, a goal needs 5 qualities. First, motivating goals have a deadline. They can be a few months away, or it may have a deadline several years from now. Therefore, a motivating goal is dated. Deadlines for motivating goals can be long-term, meaning they will occur in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years or more. Or deadlines may be short-term, meaning they will occur in the next few months. However, the key to a motivating goal is to set a deadline. Why is that? Simply put, as a deadline approaches, motivation increases. If you don't believe me, think about this. When you have a major project due, do you work on it a little at a time? Or do you only work on it as the deadline looms on the horizon? Secondly, motivating goals are challenging but are realistic. Therefore, motivating goals are achievable. We know that part of motivation is the expectation of success. Therefore, we want to make sure that any goal we set is achievable. However, if there exists no challenge to the goal, will we be motivated to work on something that bores us? Therefore, when you set a goal, err on the side of optimism. Stretch yourself to do something new. But as you do, always ask yourself, is the goal at least 50% achievable for me? Third, motivating goals are your own. Remember, you know yourself better than anyone else. Therefore, motivating goals should be personal. As you know, our culture and important individuals in our lives can influence our decisions, thereby causing us to make goals in line with others' thoughts and beliefs. Therefore, when you make a goal, be aware of subtle pressures to conform and make sure the goal is in line with what you want to have, do, or be. Fourth, motivating goals focus your energy on what you want rather than what you don't want. Therefore, motivating goals are positive. When you set a goal, determine what you want and work towards that goal. Also, eliminate negative goals and translate them into positive goals using creator language. For example, a negative goal, not to fail a course, becomes a positive goal to earn a grade of B or better. Therefore, as you identify your goals, use creator language. Finally, motivating goals state outcomes that are detailed and measurable. Therefore, motivating goals are specific. Being specific keeps you from fooling yourself into believing you've achieved a goal when in fact you haven't. It's not enough to say, my goal is to do better this semester. How will you know if you've achieved these goals? What specific, measurable evidence will you have? Therefore, instead of saying something vague like, my goal is to do better this semester, a more specific goal is, I will complete every assignment on time and to the best of my ability. In other words, make choices that create positive results. If you'll notice, the 5 components of a motivating goal spell out the acronym DAPS. Throughout this course, you may hear me refer to this process as the DAPS system. When I use this acronym, please realize that I'm challenging you to measure your goals against this system. In other words, if you utilize the DAPS system to create a motivating goal, then you're making sure your goals are dated, achievable, personal, positive, and specific. Take a look at the quote on the screen by Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt stated, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dream." There's nothing wrong with setting goals. However, checking off one task after another on life's journey can become monotonous. Additionally, working from task to task or goal to goal can be daunting work. Therefore, we sometimes need to look beyond goals. Perhaps even more than goals do, dreams fuel our inner fire. They give our life's purpose and guide our choices. Simply put, our dreams inspire us to do great things. Unlike goals, which usually fit into one of our life roles, dreams often take over our whole lives and can often take on a life of their own. So in addition to the goals that relate to your life roles, have you discovered your dream? If so, what is it? If not, what could you do to help discover your dream? If you've not discovered your dream, don't worry. It's not uncommon to spend several years determining your dream. Although we may have goals that we work towards, dreams give our lives purpose. So if you haven't discovered your dream, look for those things that make you tick. Then look for ways to integrate those things into your life. As we began this lecture, I used the analogy of a road trip, and I talked about how unwise it would be to start out on a journey with no plan or destination in mind. We know that wise travelers use maps to locate their destination and identify the best route to get there. However, as a student, have you been guilty of starting out on your academic journey with no clear direction in mind? Creators identify their goals and dreams and then identify the most direct path to get there. So, if you haven't already, now is the time to begin thinking about a life plan for your role as a student. A life plan defines your desired destination in life, and it gives your inner guide something positive to focus on when the chatter of your inner critic or your inner defender attempts to distract you. A life plan also helps get you back on course if you get lost. Simply put, a life plan is your personal definition of a life worth living. So to create your life plan as a student, you first need to identify the long-term goals you plan to accomplish. Remember, part of the DAPS process is to set a deadline or have dated goals. So as a student, where do you plan to be academically in 2, 4, or even 8 years? And once you've identified those long-term goals, the next term is to list short-term goals that will assist you in reaching your long-term goals. Just like your long-term goals, and any goal for that matter, your short-term goals need to be dated. For example, let's say your long-term goals may include completing your associate's degree and transferring to a university in 2 years, and completing your bachelor's degree in 4 years. Now that you've identified your long-term goals, you can now begin setting short-term goals to reach them. Simply put, by setting long-term goals, then creating short-term goals to reach them, you're starting with your destination in mind and working backwards. So with our long-term goals in mind, your short-term goals may be something like, in the next 5 weeks, I need to complete all of my assignments on time and to the best of my ability to pass my classes. Or, by the end of this semester, I hope to have a 3.0 GPA. Or, by the end of next semester, I hope to have enough hours to be classified as a sophomore. Simply put, our short-term goals become stepping stones, and each one completed brings us closer to the achievement of our long-term goals and dreams. However, setting goals or having dreams mean little if you are not putting effort into your goals and dreams. Remember, you don't need to know how to achieve a goal or a dream when you first think of it. After all, sometimes we cannot see a solution to our problem until we make it a commitment that is fueled by a strong desire. Then, once you promise yourself that you will do whatever it takes to accomplish your goals and dreams, you'll often discover the method for achievement is in the most unexpected ways. Therefore, to be successful in reaching your goals and dreams, you need to be committed to them. So what do we mean by commitment? Simply put, a commitment is an unbending intention, a single-mindedness of purpose that promises to overcome all obstacles, regardless of how you may feel at a particular moment. With that in mind, ask yourself these questions. First, what are you committed to? Secondly, has anyone assisted you in keeping these commitments? Next, have you ever had to sacrifice anything to guarantee you keep a commitment? Again, if you have not thought about the commitments you are willing to make, whether it be your educational pursuits or in other areas of your life, now is the time to do so. By committing to our dreams, we program our brains to look for solutions to problems and therefore find motivation to keep going when the path gets rough. In other words, when we fully commit to our dreams, we find ways to overcome any obstacles to our success. Anyone who has ever set out to complete a task knows that life will often test our commitments. To keep our commitment strong in times of challenge, we may need a clear picture of our desired results. As human beings, we seek to experience pleasure and avoid pain whenever possible. Therefore, in times of great stress, one way we can overcome obstacles and stay committed to our dreams is to visualize the pleasure we'll receive when we achieve our goals and dreams. Therefore, to effectively visualize your desired results, follow these 4 key steps. The first key is to relax. Visualizing seems to have the most positive impact when experienced during deep relaxation. One way to accomplish deep relaxation is to breathe deeply while you tighten muscle groups one by one from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. The second key is to use present tense. In other words, you want to imagine yourself experiencing success now. So as you visualize, use present tense verbs such as I'm walking across the stage or I am shaking hands with the dignitary as I receive my degree. Third, use all five of your senses as you visualize your success. Imagine the scene concretely and specifically in your mind and include all the details. Think about what you can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Finally, feel the feelings. Events gain power to motivate us when they're accompanied by strong emotions. Therefore, when you visualize, imagine that your accomplishment will be just as grand as you wish it to be. In addition to visualizing our success, another way we can stay committed towards our goals and dreams is to claim our desired personal qualities. As adults, we consciously choose what we want to believe. In other words, our thoughts create our reality. Therefore, an effective way to strengthen our desired qualities is to create a personal affirmation. A personal affirmation is a statement in which we claim desired qualities as if we already have them in abundance. Here are a few examples from your textbook. I am a bold, joyful, and generous man. I am a confident, creative, and selective woman. I am a spiritual, wise, and curious man, finding happiness in all I do. Simply put, affirmations help us breathe life into personal qualities we want or need to strengthen. Also, it helps us combat those limiting beliefs ingrained in us from others. Therefore, to strengthen your desired qualities, repeat your affirmation. The more you say it, the more you'll believe it. Secondly, dispute your inner critic. Use your affirmations to highlight what you are or would like to become, and move away from what your inner critic tries to point out as your weaknesses. Finally, align your deeds with your words. Simply thinking it isn't enough. Let what you do match what you believe. That concludes the information for this section. See you next time.